Welcome to today's webinar, Two Outstanding Research Methods, brought to you by NCSL. All lines have been placed in the listen-only mode to provide favorable sound quality during today's presentation. It is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Linda Triplett. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Linda Triplett, and I am the Director of the Mississippi Peer Committee's Performance Accountability Office. I will be moderating today's webinar. I'd like to start off by thanking the National Legislative Program Evaluation Society and the National Conference of State Legislatures for sponsoring this webinar. NLPES is the NCSL Association for legislative staff engaged in program evaluation and performance auditing. One of the Society's key purposes is to provide relevant training like this webinar to legislative staff. As NLPES Vice Chair and Chair of the NLPES Professional Development Subcommittee, I'm particularly pleased that we could bring this program to you today. Each year, the National Legislative Program Evaluation Society recognizes up to 3 offices for reports that demonstrate outstanding use of evaluation research methods. In 2016, the Louisiana Legislative Auditor and the Colorado Office of the State Auditor both won NLPES Excellence in Research Methods Awards. During this webinar, staff from Louisiana and Colorado will explain their award-winning methods. We will take your questions after both presentations have been given, but feel free to enter your questions in the chat box at the lower left of your screen at any time. Before we begin, I would like to note that this webinar is being recorded and will be archived on the NCSL website. Our presenters today are Edward Seiler and Christina Wilson with the Louisiana Legislative Auditor, and Christopher Harless and Tori Van Slyke with the Colorado Office of the State Auditor. Going first are our speakers from Louisiana, who will be discussing their award-winning report on the Louisiana Lottery Corporation. Welcome, Ed and Christina.
Hello, my name is Christina Wilson, and as Linda stated, we will be presenting information from a performance audit we did in 2015 on the Louisiana Lottery Corporation. We determined that the lottery could maximize the lottery profits to the state for K-12 education if they increased the prizes for scratch-off games. Our analysis was based on modeling the demand for scratch-off lottery tickets. To give you some background, House Concurrent Resolution 116 of the 2014 regular legislative session requested us to analyze the efficiency and effectiveness of lotteries operations. Generally, our audit topics are determined internally by our statewide risk assessment, but this time this was a special legislative request. Once we first began the audit, we went in and we started reviewing lottery's financial statements. Upon looking at that information, we saw that lottery had some increases in some of their revenues, so we wanted to see what best way they could maximize the amount of money that they provide to the state. So after meeting with lottery, we determined what their plans were to do with those increased profits. So we met with Ed to discuss ways that we could present meaningful information to the legislature. And at this time, I'll turn it over to Ed, and he will discuss the details of the analysis we provided.
Sure. Thank you, Christina. So what we did, we learned that the lottery had saved a good amount of money, millions of dollars, by switching to a different vendor for some of their computer systems that they used for the Powerball and Mega Millions type games. And so one thing they could have done with that, they could have just transferred more money to the state, but instead they decided to reinvest it in prizes for their scratch-off games. And so the question is, was that actually a good use of money? And the logic behind that is that if you put more into prizes, if players are getting more in prizes when they buy a scratch-off ticket, they'll actually buy more tickets. And so that was the logic behind it. And what we found is, we'll explain later in the report, is that yes, that as a matter of fact, that relationship does exist. In fact, if you were to increase prizes from where they are now, which is about 63% of revenues, to 70% of revenues, the state could receive an additional $3.8 million each year in recurring revenue. But the constraint there is that the lottery is required by state law to transfer 35% of their revenues to the state. And so you can see if we're telling you to, if we're saying get up to 70% in prizes, but you have to give 35% to the state, that's 5% more than you actually have right there. And it doesn't even get into the retailer commissions or their variable costs or keeping the lights on at their headquarters. So we'll get into a discussion of some of the other policy considerations that we had to account for in making those recommendations. So in analyzing sales, the first step in understanding the relationship between sales and prizes is to get data on sales and prizes. So we got this giant data set. It was about 10 gigabytes, and it had for every retailer in the state, every little gas station and convenience store, and then it had for every day of the year, and then for every game it had an entry with how many tickets were sold, how much they paid in prizes, and that sort of thing. And so that's a little bit finer detail than we needed, especially when it was 5 years worth of it. So we summarized it by parish, by game, and by month. And so that gave us a bit more manageable data set. And it's worth noting what these games are. The way that scratch-off tickets work, you buy this ticket and it has a design on it of some kind. They have themes to them. So one of them might be, I love the New Orleans Saints, or it might be a Monopoly-themed game. And they come in different price points. They have $1, $2, $3, $5, and $10 price points, and they last for about 12 to 18 months. At that point, they've really stopped selling. People get sick of them, and they change it out with something new. And so we also obtain data. We know that there are other things, and I'll discuss in just a minute the kind of model that we developed. But we also obtain data on unemployment rates, average wages, gas prices. We generated some seasonal effects variables to add to our data set, and we also accounted for the number of retailers per capita in each parish. So we also, and we'll move on to the next slide. So the demand model is kind of the key thing that we're after. We looked at some of the literature on lottery demand, and the way that economists tend to talk about demand is it's responding to an effective price. Ordinarily we talk about, the price of corn and the demand for corn, what have you. Well, in this case, it's the price of a lottery ticket. But it's not so much how much you pay for the ticket. The idea is what you're really buying is a lottery prize. And so if you're getting 50 cents back in prizes for every dollar you spend in tickets, then that means that the effective price, how much you have to pay for a dollar of prizes, is $2. Likewise, I said before, we're at about a 62.75% prize payout percentage. So if you're getting 62.75 cents on the dollar for every dollar you spend, then that's an effective price of about $1.59. And so that's kind of the key variable that they include. Now, it just so happens this is basically the reciprocal of the prize payout percentage, and so it's pretty natural to go back and forth between those two. We also wanted to account for the number of months that the game has been open. Now, in a lot of cases, if the game has been out for a while, then people are just getting tired of it, and we wanted to account for that. We also wanted to account for the seasonal variation. People's demand for lottery tickets varies throughout the year. It tends to be, for example, lower in the summer and that sort of thing. So we wanted to account for that. We also wanted to account for the number of retailers in each parish, the idea being that if the games are more accessible, if there's a higher density of places where you can go to participate, you'll buy more tickets. And like I said, we wanted to include the unemployment and wages. Now those two are kind of interesting to include in there because it's kind of ambiguous beforehand without really looking at it which way those are going to affect demand. In other words, if you have high unemployment, is that going to raise lottery demand because people feel like they're hard on their luck and they're going to be looking to buy lottery tickets? Or if it raises unemployment, are people going to say, well, I don't have a job, I need to cut back, first thing to go is lottery tickets? It's not clear. Same thing with wages. So we wanted to include that. Gas prices, we felt beforehand it'd be pretty obvious which way those should go. I mean, people are buying these tickets at the gas station, so if the gas price goes up and you say, well, there goes my income for this week, then probably that's going to affect the decision to buy a lottery ticket. And we also included separate intercepts for each price point, because if we're looking at sales per capita, a $10 game is just going to mechanically sell more than a $1 game, because you're getting 10 times as much per ticket. And we also, I'll mention, we thought about trying to include the Powerball and Mega Millions jackpots, but that kind of thing, it's kind of a noisy measure, just because there's multiple Powerball and Mega Millions jackpots in any given month, and the lottery doesn't really control those. So, and not only that, but they're pretty random. So we were able to exclude them, and they weren't significant in any event, and they weren't really the focus of our study, because they don't really, like I said, they don't really control that. So after doing all this, after we developed this whole model, and we came up with a theory of how these things relate to each other, we get to, this is really what we're after, is the price elasticity of demand. And it's a kind of technical term, but it's very important. This is the percentage change in sales for a percentage change in the prize payout percentage, which will denote P. And you'll see it in the formula below. And the idea is if the prize payout percentage goes up 1%, not 1 percentage point, so in other words, if it goes up from 50% to 50.5%, what's going to be the corresponding change in sales? And we can estimate this using a Poisson regression. And this is very similar to a least squares regression that a lot of people are familiar with. The difference is that it has to do with the fact that we want to estimate this elasticity parameter. When you're estimating an elasticity, as opposed to just measuring, if we were just measuring, dollars of change in sales for a percentage point change in the prize payouts percentage, we wouldn't transform those variables into natural logarithms. But since we're trying to get an elasticity, we took the natural logarithm of sales and the natural logarithm of the prize payout percentage. But in a lot of cases, there were games that sold 0 tickets in a particular parish in a particular month. And if you try to take the natural logarithm of 0, then you get negative infinity, and you have to lose those observations, which we don't want to do, because the fact that a game had no sales is relevant information. We want to include that in our analysis. So we used a Poisson regression, and that can handle zeros in the dependent variable much more gracefully. And that log link equation, I mentioned that just because that's what still enables us to interpret the coefficients as elasticities. And so if the prize payout percentage increases from P0 to P1, then the increase in sales is going to follow this formula. It's, the new sales, S1, just equals the old sales, S0, times that ratio, P1 over P0, to the power of epsilon. And that epsilon, as I said before, epsilon is just the coefficient on the log of the prize payout percentage from that regression. So that's where it comes from. So, and then I can turn to, these were some of the highlights from the regression that we ran. The price elasticity of demand that we estimated is about 2.88. And what that means is that a 1% increase in the prize payout percentage gives you a 2.88% increase in sales, approximately. So some of the other things, we included this information here just because it was interesting. You can see gas prices going up by 1%, decreases sales by 0.4% approximately. Wages is kind of interesting. In economics, they talk about you can have a normal good, and a normal good, you buy more of it if your income increases. Or you can have an inferior good, and an inferior good, you buy less of it when your income increases. And, you can kind of cautiously interpret this negative sign here as telling you that when wages go up, people are buying less tickets. It kind of implies that lottery tickets are an inferior good, which is an interesting term. Not that there's anything inferior about it, that's just the technical term that economists use to describe it. And so that, I should add, all these coefficients were significant. And we also found that, as expected, retailers per capita, a 1% increase in retailers per capita, you get about a 0.8% increase in sales, which makes sense. And then finally, we looked at the unemployment rate. And we ran a bunch of different models. You notice this is the only variable that we estimated separate coefficients for based on each particular price point. And we use different selection criteria, the archaic information criterion, the Bayesian information criterion, to pick the best model. And it was pretty consistently telling us that we needed to give separate slopes for each of these unemployment rates by price point. And you can see, I think the reason for that is pretty clear. The $1 and $2 games, people buy more of them when there's higher unemployment. And the $3, $5, and $10 games, people buy less of them when there's more unemployment. So they're pointing in qualitatively different directions. I think it's interesting. It shows that not all these scratch-off games are necessarily subject to the same relationship with unemployment. So we were able to take all this information, and then we developed a financial model, and we were able to say, what would happen if you changed the prize payout percentage? And the basis for this was the lottery's fiscal year 2014 CAFR. And so we basically just took that, you have the different revenues and expenditures associated with the scratch-off games. We're assuming that all the draw-style games like Powerball, Mega Millions, and they have some other little ones, all that stuff stays the same. And then we say, what would happen to the lottery's financial performance if you adjusted that prize payout percentage? So sales, it's pretty easy to calculate that. We had the formula on the previous slide. It's just the new prize payout percentage over the old one to the power of epsilon. That's epsilon is 2.88, as you might recall. And then you just multiply that times the FY14 sales, and you have the new scenarios and the new sales in the new scenario. Prizes are just equal to the new prize payout percentage times the new sales. And then the other variable costs, those are just a percentage of sales. That's things like the courier expense, the ticket printing. And then the fixed costs, we're assuming, remain unchanged. So this is an example of the model that we used. You can see, and this is just a recreation of one of the lotteries of their 2014 CAFR, just selecting the key variables that we needed to look at. The top line here is the scratch-off prize payout percentage, and you can see that we're starting at where we are now, 62.75%, increasing it to 70.41%. And now everything else follows from that. The scratch-off sales, you might wonder, okay, 221, that's an actual, 221 million, that's the actual number. Where did the 307.9 come from? Well, we just took 70.41 divided by 62.75, that gives you about 1.12. You take that to the power of 2.88, and that gives you about 1.39. So multiply 1.39 times the 221 million, and that's where you get 307.9 million from. And that's where it comes from. The prize expense is just the prize payout percentage at the top times the 307.9. And so that's how we calculate it. The other things are just a percentage of sales. The draw style games are staying the same, fixed costs staying the same. We accounted for the change in unclaimed prizes. If you're selling more tickets, then more tickets are going to go unclaimed, and so we wanted to account for that. They can use unclaimed prizes to offset their other expenses, and so that gives you a net increase in your net operating income of $4.3 million. And just to mention, I know before we mentioned it was about 3.8 million was the increase that we cited in the report, and that accounts for some other non-operating income components, particularly interest earnings, which we'll describe in a subsequent slide. But that's why there's a slight difference. So now that we have this, we figured out the relationship between sales and prizes. We estimated a model. We came up with different scenarios, and now we can look at some different policies that you could implement and what it would take to realize that. Like I said, they have to give 35% to the state, and so if you want to give 70% to the players, that you don't have 35% left over to give to the state, much less pay your retailers and pay your other variable costs. So that 35% mandate is a key constraint, and now that we have this model, we can look at how would you need to change the mandate in order to get to 70% prize payout percentage. So here are some of the scenarios that we considered. We have our baseline scenario. That's where we are now. 35% mandate, 63% scratch-off prize payout percentage. Obviously, there's no change in proceeds to the state. But then option one is, what would it take to get up to 70%? And that's where we say, well, if you want to be conservative, assume maybe there's some jump in costs because you don't want to have something locked in that's unrealistic. It would be probably about 25% is where the mandate would need to be in order to sustain that. And you would get $3.8 million more for the state every year in recurring revenue based on that change. The second option that we consider is a little bit different. One of the things that we noted in our report is that there is an unclaimed prize fund, and we talked about unclaimed prizes before. There was about $27 million sitting in that account, and the state's having budget problems as it has been for the past several years, and there's been a lot of sweeping of funds, and that fund, certainly people had their eye on it, or were going to, and the problem is that the lottery had been operating at a deficit for a while because of that high mandatory transfer percentage. They really needed to eat into that fund in order to maintain prizes just where they were. And so what we wanted to show is, okay, well, if you took away that fund and they had to balance their budget, and if they had to do so with some wiggle room in case they had a significant drop in the draw style ticket sales or what have you, you'd really need to lower that scratch-off prize payout percentage to 51%. And if they had to do that, the state would see a $16 million decrease in proceeds. So, and ultimately, it's interesting to note that they did choose option two. They took that fund, but they did not adjust the mandate. And I think the lottery was able to absorb that because in the subsequent fiscal year, they had record-breaking Powerball sales. I think it was in national news how high the Powerball was, and they were able to build up their reserves somewhat. But it is still a situation that they're vulnerable to, and it's something that we do plan to monitor going forward. So in conclusion, we talked about how we found out they were increasing prizes. We wanted to know what was it doing, what was the effect of it. We studied the literature, developed a model. We estimated that model to see what the relationships between the different variables were, particularly sales and prizes. And we used that model to study how the lottery's financial performance would change if you adjusted prizes. And then we put all that into some simulations and looked at how you would need to adjust the state's policy on mandatory transfers to the state from the lottery in order to realize those goals. So, in conclusion, that's about all for our slides, and with that, I'll hand it back to Linda. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ed and Christina. I would like to remind everyone that you can enter questions in the chat box at any time. Oh, very good. I see another question. Okay. Next are our speakers from Colorado, who will be discussing their award-winning performance audit of the Department of Revenue's Administration of Local Sales Tax. Welcome, Chris and Tori.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you also, Ed and Christina, for an excellent presentation. We're going to talk to you today about our audit of the local sales tax collection and distribution here in Colorado. And one of the things that we want to highlight as we go through this is the way that we used a geographic information system tool, or GIS tool, to use mapping in our analysis. This is something that's new to us here in Colorado, and so we wanted to just sort of spur your imagination for ways in which you might be able to use GIS analysis in an audit or a program evaluation. So, but before we begin, why would we want to use GIS in a program evaluation? Basically, it's because there are some questions that really require a spatial thinking for an answer. And so, for example, maps can help us see and analyze concentrations of information, for example, population density. It can help you see distributions of items within a geographical space, for example, which areas of your state have more hospitals. It can also help you analyze distance relations between things. For example, here in Colorado, this is an important question. Are there any marijuana shops, and if so, how many that are within 1,000 feet of a school? And it occurs to me that even in Ed's presentation, there could have been an opportunity to use GIS to analyze the relationship of retailers to gasoline prices. That could have been represented spatially. So for us, though, most of us are familiar with the way GIS can be used to create maps. And we had been thinking that you could use GIS sort of at the tail end of an analysis. Say once you've done some analysis on some data, then you could load it into GIS and create a nice map for your report. Also, it occurred to us that, well, you might use GIS sort of to do the analysis, in which case the end product would be, again, be some map that you're going to export. The aha moment came for us, or at least for me anyway, I will say, when I realized that GIS is not just a graphical tool that you can use to create beautiful maps, but it's also a database in itself. And so, as such, you can use it to create data tables that you can then analyze outside of GIS. So, in other words, on this project, what you'll see is a way in which we sort of flipped the tools, if you will, and used GIS at the beginning of our analysis, and then did more of the heavy lifting outside of GIS. So just to get a little bit of an understanding of what this project was about, I'm going to talk about local sales taxes in Colorado. It's a complex system. We have about 297 cities, towns, counties, special districts, local improvement districts, and transportation authorities, which have the ability to enact a sales tax on any sales to a customer. Each jurisdiction has the authority to set its own sales tax rate and to define allowable exemptions within statutory parameters. So given that, the amount of sales taxes that a business is supposed to collect from a customer varies across the state, and it depends on the location of the sale within the patchwork of jurisdictions. The Colorado Department of Revenue is responsible for collecting sales taxes from businesses on behalf of most of the local governments in the state. There are some large cities, for example, Denver, Fort Collins, Boulder, Colorado Springs, that are what we call home rule cities, and they are able to, they've opted out of the Colorado Department of Revenue's process, and they are responsible, therefore, for collecting sales taxes directly from the retailers within their boundaries. But for most of the counties and smaller municipalities, the Department of Revenue collects that sales tax and then turns around and distributes it back to those jurisdictions. This is a map just to give you an idea visually of what we're talking about in terms of the complexity of the sales tax system. This is the suburbs sort of north of Denver, the Denver metro area. And what you see here is, I wanted to just draw your attention to this area. I'm going to see if I can get the cursor to come up. Yeah, I think this is an area known as Erie. So this light gray area shows the boundaries for the town of Erie, which is able to collect a sales tax. What's interesting is the Regional Transportation District, which is indicated by the diagonal lines, covers some parts of Erie, but not all of it. And even within Erie, there's this little white spot indicating an area that is not incorporated within the town, nor is it subject to RTD taxes. So you can just get an idea that, if you're a business in this little area here indicated by the arrow, it might be difficult for you to know whether you're responsible for collecting sales taxes for the town of Erie, for RTD, or maybe none of it. Maybe you think that you're outside of Erie and only would then collect sales taxes for the county. So the audit was really generated by a legislative request in which the question that we received was, are local governments receiving the correct amount of sales tax revenue? During our initial research in planning the audit, we discovered that despite that complexity that I just showed you, the Department of Revenue does not have or use a map to determine which sales taxes apply to a business. They have no GIS tool that they use. Well, we found out that occasionally they will look up a business address in a mapping system, but they did not have a regular process for that kind of analysis. And so we saw that as a major risk area. So with that risk area in mind, we kind of refocused the question a bit to look at how do we know that businesses are collecting the right amounts for the right jurisdictions based on the actual physical location. Now, a key control in this, which is the control that we really focused on in our audit, is the registration process. That is the process by which a business applies for a sales tax license, and the Department of Revenue then assigns it a location code, which is actually printed on the sales tax license itself. And that location code is what the Department of Revenue then uses within its system to determine the sales taxes that it should be collecting. So you can imagine a lookup table, if you will. For every location code that represents a particular area of the state, it'll be connected to all the jurisdictions. So the county, the special district, the city, if there is one, the metropolitan district, there could be others, housing authorities that they're supposed to collect for. So why use GIS? Again, during this process of registering a business for a sales tax license, the Department of Revenue relies heavily on information supplied by the business. But what we found was, in a lot of cases, that that information really isn't sufficient to determine the precise location in relationship to those squiggly line boundaries. Zip codes in particular are imprecise. So to the extent that they were relying on zip codes to determine their taxation, that would be you would get a lot of error that way. Business owners may not know whether they are truly inside or outside of a municipality, and we found a lot of instances in which the address may say one city, but they in fact the business is actually within the boundaries of a neighboring city. So the ultimate goal for us was not so much a map that we could put in our report, although we did create maps for the report, but we wanted to create a table of data showing for each business what their actual tax liability should be based on where they are, and then we could compare that table to the data that the department had, or whatever the lookup table was showing based on their location code, and see if there's a discrepancy. So for us, the map and the GIS sort of spatial analysis was a means to an end. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Tori to talk about how we did that.
Thank you, Chris, and good day, everybody. One takeaway that I hope you all get from this presentation, or our presentation as well, is GIS is a very complex and big system you can do a lot with. But for those GIS users out there, you'll see that when I get to the slides on what we did in the analysis side, we didn't do a lot of super heavy in-depth GIS work. So this is to show that you don't need to be a GIS expert to do audit-related analysis. And I will give a shout out to my former office and other NLPES participant of the Montana Legislative Audit Division. Working there, I learned GIS, got to start with GIS and learned it within an audit context, and was able to use it in these other audits to show that we can do some spatial analysis that has a pretty big impact and relevant findings for performance audit work. So just some terminology, and I'll insert here too that we use the Esri software package of ArcGIS, so mainly ArcMap 10.3, so this terminology is mainly related to that, but it applies a lot to a lot of other GIS systems. The GIS data can be represented in two broad ways, vector or raster data. Vector data can be points, lines, or polygons, and points, think of just like the name suggests, buildings, mountain peaks, fire hydrants, things that are points on our map. Lines like rivers and flight paths, things that are continuous points or series of points on our map. And polygons. Polygons are the shapes that are a shape enclosed by a boundary, something that we can calculate an area from. Things like cities and lakes and even buildings can be represented in either point form or polygon form. The other type is raster data. Raster data is a little more complex, and I'll give you a visual example on the next slide. But it's essentially, think of really detailed Landsat images or aerial photography type data. And what we can do with raster data is divide or slice that up into equal size pixels or cells. And each of those pixels or cells, when we click on it or go into it, can tell us various types of information within the layer. So a matrix of raster data might have information on elevation or soil saturation or things like that that could be useful for land planning. So all this data we pull together and represent in what's called a layer. And a layer is just the contents of that map that we can see geographically. And it's all pulled together in what we can import, and we can layer the layers on top of each other to do our analysis. So here's kind of the world broken out. As you can see on the left, we have kind of just an image of kind of a SimCity type diagram of a city and waterways and forests. And we can explode that on the right into the various layers that make up that worldview, such as imagery and addresses, water features, things like that. So keep this visual in mind because it is relevant to this taxation example. Instead of imagery, elevation, and transportation, we can think of state, counties, cities, special districts. And that green on the lower left is just an example of raster data. The smaller image shows kind of an aerial or bird's eye view of maybe a farm or some type of land use, and we can zoom in, and then again each of those cells or pixels we can click on, and that color might tell us something about elevation or pitch or soil saturation and different things, water or what type of land it is. Some more terminology. So each of those layers, each of the geographic things that we can see on our map has data underneath it, which is represented in GIS in what's called an attribute table. And with that attribute table, we have each field can store a specific type of data. Field is also a column. So our screenshot here is actually from our local sales tax data. So each of those columns might have an address or a city or a county or what type of business it is, and each record or row and how it relates to that. So this is the table that underlies our data visually. So what did we need? Well, to do this analysis, we first needed those tax jurisdictions. We needed all the tax boundaries in the state, all the layers out there. And it's important to note, too, that since this had never been done before in our state, we had to do a little bit of legwork to get all that data. So we talked to various state agencies, local governments, cities, counties, special districts on pulling together all the taxation boundaries that we could. Some of them we were able to get for free online through city and county websites. Some we had to contact cities and counties directly, and some we got from various state agencies. But again, many of them were out there online, so your states may be similar in that most of this GIS data is actually out there that government entities are publishing for public use. So we pulled all these together, the different layers for the different taxing districts, as you can see there. And then we had the business addresses, which we worked with the Colorado Department of Revenue to get the addresses for all the businesses that are registered with sales tax licenses to collect sales taxes in the state. And then we needed a tool to be able to take those addresses, the 1, 2, 3 main streets in our data set, and have them show up in our map as a point, as something that we can analyze against. So that's where we got to geocoding. We took the businesses and had that tool so that we can bring them up on our map. And geocoding is just that, taking a real world location, a place, anything from a house to a mile marker to whatever, and making that represent on our map in the form of an X and Y coordinate. So what did we do? Well, first, we got all of those layers on the taxation boundaries. Think it back before to that visual example, all those different layers for cities, counties, special districts. And we combined all of them using the union tool into one multifaceted layer. So instead of 15 layers, we had one layer with 15 columns, 15 attributes that were each a different taxing district. We then geocoded. Again, we assigned an X and Y coordinate for each of those businesses that we had in our data set, and those appeared in our map as points. Finally, we used the intersect tool. So what we did is we said, okay, GIS, combine the two. Combine all of our tax layer and our points and see what happens. So we were essentially saying, for every point on our map, let's drill down, if you will, and tell us every single taxing attribute that that point touches. And then we know, from at least from in our GIS universe, for each address that we had on our map, what tax jurisdictions were relevant to it. What did it touch? What was it subject to? So here's a graphic representation. These are the next couple of slides are screenshots from our GIS application. Here's the state of Colorado with all 64 of our counties. You can see the city and county of Denver there in kind of the mauve coral salmon color in the center. And then just to the west, you'll see Eagle County in the beige color and Beaver Creek as it's one of our resort communities up in the mountains. So we're going to zoom in on the Beaver Creek area. So now notice Beaver Creek is at the bottom of this slide and still that green circle. That means, what this means is it's not an incorporated community. Beaver Creek, which you hear a lot when people talk about this area of the mountains, is actually not a town. It's just an unincorporated community, a census designated place. However, those red lines are Interstate 70. This is along the Interstate 70 mountain corridor. It is just south of an actual town called Avon that is an incorporated community. And by extension, it has the ability to enact a local sales tax. Notice that in this area there's also a metropolitan district, which is a form of special district, namely the Bachelor Gulch MDT, that's to the left in the green color. And all of those points are the businesses from our data set that we geocoded. So you can see, and I'll turn on my pointer here just to kind of direct your attention, you can see there's these various pockets again that aren't incorporated, or there's these points like this one that are right on a boundary. So it's really important to make sure we have accurate representation of where these businesses are in relation to the incorporated and non-incorporated areas of a community or of taxation districts. So this just gives a graphic representation of, again, what we saw. And then what we did at this point was we took that attribute table that I mentioned before that had all of the results of combining our tax districts and our points, our business addresses, and then to do the next level of analysis, we exported it to Microsoft Access. And so I'll hand it back to Chris, and he's going to talk a little bit about how we did this work in Access.
Thanks, Tori. So the results of our analysis in GIS presented a table that looks something like this. On the left, you see the address of businesses as we received them from the Department of Revenue. On the right, you see the columns that were added by the GIS tool. And so each column represents a different type of taxing jurisdiction. And what's great about this is if a business is in an unincorporated area, for example, here I'm going to turn the cursor back on. Here you see this 397 Prater Lane. It says it's in the town of Avon, according to Department of Revenue, but in reality, according to our GIS work, you see that this has a null value in the city fields, which means that it isn't actually touching any, or it isn't touching or within any incorporated city's boundaries. So that means even though it has an Avon address, it's not actually in the town of Avon. But it is in Eagle County, and it is in the Bachelor Gulch district, so it should be collecting taxes for those. If you look here, though, you also see an example, another example down here in row 16. Here's a city that had an Inglewood address, a business that had an Inglewood address, but it's actually in the town of Centennial. So if that business was collecting taxes for Inglewood, then it would be doing so improperly. It should be collecting taxes for Centennial. So it was that sort of discrepancy that we needed to then analyze, which we couldn't do in GIS, but we did within Access, to not only see did differences between the reported address, but also those lookup codes that I was those location codes that I was talking about. So what we did then was we created a similar table based on those location codes to represent all of the taxing jurisdictions that the Department of Revenue said that the businesses should be collecting for, and then compared it to the results that you see here. And the results of that was that after excluding some businesses that had really strange addresses, like corner of 12th and Main, which were difficult, virtually impossible to map with the tool that we had. We really needed standardized addresses. We were able to nevertheless map 103,836 businesses, which is virtually the whole population of businesses that were registered to collect sales taxes for that year. We found that about 11,000 of them were misregistered. That means they were showing a location code that had tax implications that we showed were incorrect. That's about 11% error rate. So as I said before, the Department of Revenue does not collect sales taxes for certain cities. So when you exclude the home rule cities that are required to collect for themselves, the error was about 3,746 businesses were misregistered for jurisdictions that the Department of Revenue collects sales taxes for. And just looking at those 3,746, not the total 11,000, we found that, let me back up. The next step of our analysis was not only just to stop there. We could have stopped there, but we really wanted to demonstrate the effect. So the way that we did that was we took the output of our GIS analysis and did a reverse lookup table, if you will, to determine, based on the taxing jurisdictions that we see these businesses are actually within, what should the correct location code be? And then once we did that, we were able to then apply the tax percentages based on the reported sales and estimate the potential overcollections and undercollections. So for a business that was not collecting for a city or for a special district that it should have been collecting for, that would represent an undercollection. Or a business that was collecting for a city but it wasn't really within those boundaries, that would represent an overcollection. So you see the numbers there, about 3.3 million on the overcollection and 3.8 million on the undercollection side. An interesting side benefit of this analysis that we did, though, was that we found that there were quite a few businesses anyway, or enough to be concerned, for which we were unable to assign a location code. And the reason is because they were in an area that had a combination of taxing districts for which the Department of Revenue did not have a location code established for that particular combination. And I'm going to switch to this map and let Tori explain that a little bit.
Sure, thanks, Chris. So yeah, as Chris mentioned, when we tried to do that reverse lookup, as Chris mentioned, and say, all right, well, for all these ones that are in the wrong one, that have the wrong location code, what should their location code be? And we found about 9 areas in the state, and this is an exhibit from our report that shows 2 of them, where the combination of county, city, special district, that area there was a location code for. So the town of Watkins on the, let me turn my pointer back on, oh, it's still there. So this town of Watkins down here is actually an unincorporated community, but notice how it's in that RTD, it's in that hashed area. But what we found was there's only one location code for Watkins and did not have the RTD district, or Regional Transportation District. So that was an example of under-collecting. If you were a business in that area, you were not being required to collect the RTD sales tax. Conversely, these areas of Aurora, the town of Aurora in Adams County, the only location code that's for incorporated Aurora in Adams County included RTD, so these areas. However, we found that there was no such code for Aurora in Adams County without RTD. So these businesses were over-collecting. They were collecting RTD when they didn't need to. So this just shows, as Chris mentioned, kind of an ancillary benefit we had of doing this analysis is we found there's also holes in the system so that businesses aren't collecting the right amounts. So with that, that's our presentation on how we use GIS in a performance audit context. And, oh yes, and I'll mention real quick that we did issue recommendations to the Department of Revenue. They agreed with all of them, and they are working to implement a GIS system to enhance the registration of businesses for sales tax licenses. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris and Tori. We appreciate all of the excellent presentations that we have heard today. We will now move into our question and answer period, and I see we don't have a great deal of time, and thank everyone for the questions they have submitted. I will direct the questions to our panelists, but if we're not able to answer them all in the time frame that we have, the panelists have agreed to answer them offline after the webinar. Okay. So our first question we'll take from Greg Fugate, who, by the way, is the chair of our NLPES Executive Committee. Greg asks, how did lottery management react to the results of your modeling? And, of course, this is for Ed and Christina.
Well, thanks, Mr. Fugate, for your question. We showed them our analysis, and it comported with what they had been saying for a long time, which is that they really should be at a higher prize payout percentage. So that I think they were supportive of the findings. They use a similar model from a vendor. They like to talk about the fact that it has 64 variables, like it's Heinz 57 flavors or whatever it is. It's kind of their trademark thing. I think their biggest concern was that the policy recommendations surrounding the mandate and the fund, and I think they foresaw that it was just going to result in a loss of reserves and that nothing was going to happen to the mandate, and that's ultimately what happened. So I think they were supportive of the analysis that we did, maybe a little bit concerned about putting the results out there and the political upshot of doing so. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay, thank you. I think let's get to a question for Chris and Tori, and so we'll take up Jason's question next. Chris and Tori, did you have any problems dealing with the businesses that might use a headquarter address but have multiple offices?
Thank you, Linda. I'll take that one. Thank you, Mr. Dufras, for that question. If a business has multiple addresses, in Colorado, they were required to have separate sales tax license for each location. So, and so they would be reporting sales for those locations. An interesting thing that's related, though, is that if a business has sort of no physical location, maybe has or maybe has delivery trucks that travels around the state, that posed an interesting problem. That was a whole separate set of businesses that we were not looking at. We were not looking at those types of businesses because there's not a whole lot we can do to determine without getting their delivery receipts to identify the exact homes that they were visiting or whatnot. However, that we did discuss that in our report, the complexity of that, and so for those businesses that do that, they have to pretty much rely on the self-reporting of the business in terms of where the sale took place. So that was an area of complexity that we were not able to address directly, but we did talk about the problems involved.
Okay, thank you. Let's go back to Amber's question for Ed and Christina. Did you factor in the decrease of scratch sales related to a smaller Powerball prize payout?
Well, thank you for the question, Ms. Robbins. Yeah, we had hoped to be able to measure the effect of jackpots on the scratch-off sales, since that's obviously the Powerball jackpots have a very big effect on Powerball sales, and same for Mega Millions. But the problem that we faced was that we were trying to do this analysis at a monthly level, and they had multiple drawings per month. I think to do that, we really would have needed to look at it on a daily basis and look at the daily Powerball, and that would have been, I think it's a very possible analysis. I think it's certainly something that's worth doing. I think the challenge is that we would just need a larger data set. It also really wouldn't be something that we could recommend to our lottery, since they really only have one vote. But it might be something very interesting for all of the the multi-state lottery association states, since they've been doing all this work to try to increase Powerball jackpots and increase Powerball sales, and it might be interesting to know if that's just cannibalizing one of their other business lines. So thank you very much for your question. I hope I've answered it.
Thank you. Let's go back to Chris and Tori. And can you look at the questions from Caitlin, and could you address them, maybe see which one you think has the broadest audience, and maybe answer one offline, or maybe answer them both from Caitlin?
Sure, this is Tori. Thanks for the question, Caitlin. Thank you, Linda. They're pretty straightforward. The first one, GIS has a geocoding tool within it, but the number of addresses we were wanting to geocode, it was actually going to cost a fair amount. So part of the work we did, we ended up in researching layers. We were working with the state's Office of Information Technology, OIT, which is an executive branch agency, and they have a GIS unit within them, and they've developed their own geocoding tool. So we have an in-state geocoding tool that made life quite nice, and they rely on census data, Tiger data, if you're familiar with those data sets, to develop an in-house geocoding tool. Caitlin, your other question, yes, that's kind of always a vexing problem in the GIS world. We had layers that were in a different coordinate system. For our listeners out there, think back to grade school. Think of your wall maps of the world, and think of the different types. Remember, the problem is converting the round world into a square or rectangular interface, and we have to stretch it and tweak it and make it fit that shape. So think of the maps where Greenland is gigantic. I mean, Greenland's already large, or Canada is gigantic. That's one type of projection. Or the type where, so yeah, there's various out there. So we had a methodology where we looked at all the coordinate systems and ran a conversion tool within GIS to make sure they all were in the same coordinate plane and projection. So we did have to correct for that.
Okay, I believe we might have time for the last question from Kiernan. Of the businesses that were over-collecting, did you look at what was being paid, or if they were pocketing any of it? I don't know who wants to take that question.
Kieran, yeah, thanks for that. It was being paid. When we say over-collecting, that's what they were doing. They were actually collecting that tax and remitting it to the Department of Revenue. So that's the question of pocketing is more of the Department of Revenue's auditors that would go out and audit businesses to make sure they were submitting the correct amounts of sales tax. But what we looked at was the businesses that were actually turning in that money to the Department of Revenue. So we didn't look at that potential nefarious activity from a tax audit perspective, but we were looking at it from, again, that performance audit perspective of were they just in the right districts, and were they submitting the correct amounts of overall tax to the Department of Revenue based on their locations.
Okay, well, thank you. We're right up at an hour, so thank you again so much, Ed, Christina, Chris, and Tori, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. Again, this webinar has been recorded and will be made available on the NCSL website in the next couple of weeks. Thank you again for your participation. This webinar is now concluded.